The silver lining of being fired from a career spanning almost 13 years was that the experience was harsh enough to jolt Raymond Chandler out of his self-destructive path. Jobless, he retreated to Seattle, where he managed to kick the booze. After 2 months there, however, he received word that his ex-lover, the love of his life, Sissy Pascal, had fallen ill with pneumonia again. Now, his instinct told him to go be with her and do all he could for her. Thus, he returned to L.A. He didn't own much of anything. He did nonetheless have enough money to support himself and Sissy for the immediate future. With no family who could offer lifelines in times of disaster, he had always been very conscious of how little stood between himself and Skid Row, particularly if he were to start drinking again. So he remained sober. Furthermore, there wasn't a single person in the city whom he could count on to bail him out or even offer a room in which to stay. Similarly, Sissy had no money. Plus, she'd successfully insulted most of her friends who might have previously lent a hand. All they had was one another against the world. So they devised a plan to get away from the high cost of central Los Angeles to the cheaper rental apartments in Santa Monica. At the same time, Raymond was busy discovering how to make money from writing fiction. They survived totally on the money he'd saved up. Though he'd written poetry in the past, it was a daring decision to decide that he would enter a branch of writing completely foreign to him. Fiction. What kind of fiction, he wondered. Driving up and down the Pacific coast, he began to pick up pulp magazines. Now, seeing as they were cheap enough to throw away once he was done with them, and since women's magazines didn't appeal, it was a fair deal. What he discovered was forceful and honest writing that captivated him. He came to the realization that writing pulp fiction could be a good way to learn how to write while simultaneously getting paid a nominal sum. However, he decided to approach his new endeavor more methodically than he'd approached his earlier poetry writings. He was business-minded enough and patient enough this time around to understand that he first needed to learn the mechanics of fiction in order to sell whatever talent he had. So, just as he'd done to become an accountant, he enrolled in a local evening course and bought a few books on the subject. Soon enough, he noticed that fiction was far more demanding than he'd expected. "I could hardly get his hat off," Chandler would say of one of his early exercises. He figured that it would be 2 to 3 years before he could get a character out of a room convincingly, and even longer before he could control a scene involving more than 2 characters. Writing was, nonetheless, a form of discipline that an alcoholic on the dry could lean on to keep himself occupied. On the other hand, there was the necessity to bring in some money as well. Well, gradually, he grew more fascinated by the mechanics. He even experimented with the physical process of typing. He began using narrow yellow pieces of paper which he would feed into his typewriter with the long edge horizontal. Each sheet was about the size of a small paperback book laid on its side, which allowed him room to write only 12 to 15 lines. It was a trick, he discovered, which forced him to put a bit of magic onto each small sheet, be it an image, description, or a wisecrack. It kept the writing fast and tight, and also helped him to avoid revising and editing. Instead, he would rewrite the whole page if he deemed it less than optimal. Another method he used to sharpen his skills was trying to rewrite a story he liked. After completing his version, he'd reread the original story and try to catch the weaknesses in his own writing. By doing this, he was also learning that intricate and impossible-to-explain flow of a well-written story. Since the 1920s, American fiction had veered towards tough, hard-boiled detective stories. As a result, pulp magazines began to appear, one of these being Black Mask. And by 1933, Black Mask was exclusively publishing crime stories and had a well-respected circulation of more than 100,000 issues a month. Now, Chandler's first submission, which was accepted by Black Mask, Blackmailers Don't Shoot, took 5 months to write. During this time, he rewrote the story 5 times, a dedication that revealed just how serious he was about becoming a real writer and not merely making a quick buck. The story, however, was and is almost completely indecipherable. Even after repeated readings, it proves near impossible to understand what is taking place in the story. Now, this is partly a consequence of his refusal to map out plots. He considered them superfluous to the new realistic spirit of detective fiction. He felt that the English-style twist-in-the-tail mystery stories went heads up against the realism of detective fiction, saying, "To get the surprise murderer, you fake character. If people want to play that game, it's all right by me. But for Christ's sake, let's not talk about honest mysteries. They don't exist." Now, it is quite possible that the story would have been less confusing if the detective of the story were the narrator, but Blackmailers Don't Shoot is written in the third person, making the story even more difficult to comprehend. Well, he continued to experiment with different types of narratives in his Black Mask stories, before he finally settled for the first-person narrative that would become his trademark. Now, while he started work on his second Black Mask story in 1933, he and Sissy continued to exhaust his savings. The $180 he received for Blackmailers was a nominal amount for 5 months' work, even during the Depression. Now, after earning almost $3,000 a month as an accountant, he despised having no money and felt no sense of dignified poverty about his situation. He disagreed entirely with the idea that struggling writers were more creative the closer they were to the breadline. Well, he and Sissy were on the edge of joining that line. "I never slept in the park, but I came damn close to it. It didn't kill me, but neither did it increase my love of humanity." Now, Sissy's patience with and continued love for Chandler over this time won his eternal respect. Living as reclusively as they did in their Santa Monica apartment, the two of them became inseparable and fell back in love again. Now, jumping to October 1934, when his third story was published, Finger Man, written in the first person, this story revealed that he was finding his footing. Now, despite being hard to decipher, he held his own in the 2 earlier stories, but now he was starting to do something profoundly different and doing it with confidence, while achieving growing recognition and earning larger fees, though still never more than $350 for his Black Mask stories. He and Sissy continued to live in low-rent Santa Monica. Even writing 5 stories a year, as he did in 1936, only earned him $1,500. He was still not producing stories quickly enough to reach the 1,000,000 words a year that a pulp writer needed to turn out in order to get a decent income. Though things were dire, a break came in 1938 when Sidney Sanders, a New York literary agent, showed some of Chandler's pulp stories to publisher Alfred Knopf. Now, Knopf was impressed, so Knopf reached out to him with the news that he'd be interested in reading a full novel from him. Chandler was 50 years old, but he was far from being done.